I'm reviewing the playlist called Bus Company X app. The first video is called Git User Practical Information. And this information should be in my vimrc repository. However, I found out that it's not. So I'm adding the information from that video to gitconcept.txt. Here I added this part and I'll be adding some more. By the way, vimrc is a place where I document pretty much the same information that's in my playlists and videos on YouTube, but this way it's in a text file, and someday I'm going to make it searchable through my buscompanyx.com web app. At least it'll be searchable for the user who is myself. And I say that because, remember, Bus Company X app has artificial intelligence and it holds conversations with people. So it knows who I am and what my role is in my organization. And it talks to me and lets me know the things that I should be able to know as being Sam Labib. Now I'm going to talk about the next video, which is called Building My PHP Project from Nothing into Something. Before I move on, it's important to point out something, since I was talking about the Git user. I am dealing with 3 different environments. There's the Unix environment on my Mac, which is right here when I open the iTerm. The second Unix environment, which has a Git user, is when I open my virtual machine and I start Sandbox. That's another Unix environment which has a Git user. The third environment which has a Git user is my production environment. And I log into that by typing this alias right here, and it takes me into sam.buscompanyx.com host. This video is about the general steps that I take when I'm starting a new PHP project in general on my computer and in my virtual machine and in my production environment. Here I start off by talking about where I would create the project. I would create a folder over here in VB Shared Sandbox, and I wouldn't have to be running my virtual machine in order to do this. Anything that's being saved here is also going to be, since this is the shared folder, it's also going to be in my virtual machine. Now, in each one of my 3 environments, I edit the bash RC so that there's an alias. So instead of always having to type cd and then the path to my project, I can just enter that alias and I'll automatically be put into that directory for the project, no matter which environment I'm in. So on my Mac, on my virtual machine, and on the production environment, I'll have an alias that'll take me directly to the project folder when I'm at the command line. Next, I talked about something which is very important: the permissions for the files in the project. Those are preserved by Git. So when I create these files, I'm going to be in my Mac in the Unix environment. And then I push the changes to GitHub and I pull them into my production environment. So therefore, in all 3 of these environments, my permissions for the files are going to be the same as what I set them at in my Git repository on my Mac. That's why I should not be pushing changes from my virtual machine. I should be pushing them only from my Mac's Unix environment. Now, here are the steps for making the project folder into a Git repository. On this page, I'm basically talking about when to make changes to file permissions and folder permissions on the server. I'm talking about production server, and when to make them in my development environment on my Mac. For script files or any files that are going to be managed by Git, always make file permission and folder permission changes. Do that on the Mac. However, if I have folders and files, for example, like the log directory or an upload directory, keep in mind directory and folder are the same thing, okay? If I have those, then I can go ahead and make the permission changes on the production server, since those files and directories are not managed by the Git repository. And I may need the permissions on those to be set differently from the way I would have them in my development environment. As a matter of fact, those files and directories may not even exist in my development environment. Okay, this is something that should just be kept in the back of your mind. In this part of the video that you see in front of you, I'm not going to talk about it much in this video because it basically covered some confusing aspects of the fact that my production environment was CentOS, which is like Red Hat, and my development environment was Ubuntu. Suffice it to say that having that kind of setup is not ideal, because Red Hat, which is the proprietary version of CentOS, that has a different default settings, like a default mask and a default way of handling file permissions. As a matter of fact, the Apache that's on a Red Hat system is configured to be a different user. That user, I believe, is called nobody, whereas in Ubuntu, it's called www3 or something. So the takeaway from this is, if you're going to be using Ubuntu on your development environment, it's a good idea to also use Ubuntu on the production environment. As a side note, I found this useful course called User Experience Fundamentals for Web Design, and it has caused me to reconsider my approach for the user interface. As you may recall, previously I mentioned that I would like it to be as a conversation with the user. However, after finding this course, I believe a more traditional approach would be appropriate. And since my website is going to resemble a more traditional content management type of user interface, I would also like to point out this other useful course on lynda.com called Up and Running with Markdown. I didn't think that lynda.com would have a course on Markdown, but they do, so I'm going to make use of Markdown in my web application.